Hello. So in my time here, I'm going to tell you a few things about love and a lot of things about politics. In the movie When Harry Met Sally, Sally Albright breaks up with her boyfriend Joe after realizing that she wasn't in love with Joe, she was in love with the idea of Joe. Not the person he actually was, the person she constructed in her head about him. How many of us, by show of hands, have had this experience in relationships? There are a few hands in the room. I am fascinated by how we address problems as a public, problems that many of us face and see, but problems too massive for any of us to overcome on our own. Climate change, extreme poverty and inequality, the marginalization and victimization of the poor. These are problems that I see as being critical to the future prosperity and survival of the human race, but problems that I don't think we've done near enough to solve in any significant way. Politics is one way we can solve problems as a society. Our political leaders have levers at their fingertips that are far more powerful than any other kind of lever in the world. I'm engaged in following public problems. I'm interested in solving public problems. And because I believe politicians have the ability to do that better than any of the rest of us, I've been engaged in politics for 10 years and I've worked in it for 8. And in an ideal democracy, these levers give us, the citizens, we the people, the ability to control and appoint our elected leaders and shape the society that we want to live in. But we don't live in an ideal democracy. A few years ago, I had a realization, something like Sally Albright, that it's not democracy and politics that I'm in love with, it's the idea of democracy. And I'm not unconvinced that the idea of democracy in my head is necessarily all that different from the one you have in yours. In the time I've got here with you today, I'd like to propose 3 ideas that may come as a surprise. Not to people who know me necessarily, but to people who are passionate about democracy. I don't think the democracy we have in many parts of the Western world is sustainable. I think our democratic institutions have historically brought us progress, but I don't think future progress is going to be possible within those institutions. And I think that we're all somewhat responsible for it because those of us who are engaged repeatedly tell some white lies about it that push big problems with those institutions under the rug. So there's some big statements. Give me some space to back them up. Our democracy is unsustainable. Our democracy is unsustainable because it doesn't actually need a critical mass of humans to get on. It needs some of us for sure. Before I unpack that statement, let me talk about a system that does a really good job of needing humans. That system is the market. All of us are included in the market, not necessarily as equal participants, but we're always included as active participants. When's the last time you've gone more than a week without buying something? The market does this because it's critical for it that we keep buying things. Every time you push an advertisement for a product, that's the market's way of saying, you need me. And it's a classic case of reverse psychology, though, on a massive scale, because it's not that humans need markets to survive, markets need humans. There's all kinds of cases where humans get by for many years without money or markets, and yet there isn't a single market that gets by without humans. And because this works this way, people that sell things in the market are keenly aware that if you don't buy things, they suffer and so does everybody else. So when the going gets rough, people within the market start to collaborate in ways you wouldn't expect of competitors. Oil-producing companies join industry associations and buy ads with other oil-producing companies. Milk companies do the same. But politics doesn't work this way. When the going gets rough in politics, politicians attack one another. They do things that make us want to pull away from it. Now, if it did work this way, politicians would be people that we hold in quite high regard. We'd say they're mostly trustworthy people, and they generally do what's best. That's not what we think, though. Politicians themselves don't even think that. An exit interview done by a national organization called Samara with former members of parliament found that while most politicians, former politicians, thought that about themselves as an individual, as a lot, they were quite dismissive of the trustworthiness and ability to get things right of other politicians. Most people that I know that get engaged don't get engaged because they trust that system. They get engaged because they're not sure that it's going in the right direction and they want to affect that. But that's a shrinking number of people. In the last half century, the number of people voting in elections in all of the Western world, but particularly in North America, has been in decline. At the same time, polling firms like the company Ecos have been asking North Americans how much they trust the governments in Ottawa and in Washington to do what's right. They've been asking them if they trust them, and the number of people who have been saying yes to that question has been in decline virtually as long as they've been asking it. And yet, the people who sell on the political marketplace, the people who are trying to push their agendas to us to get our support for it, while confidence is shrinking, while the number of people voting is in decline, their lives are virtually unaffected. There still ends up being somebody in charge. They still end up with just as much ability to tax us, to take our money, to spend it through budgeting, and to make laws that tell us what we can and what we can't do. Now, earlier I mentioned that it's not that humans need markets, it's that markets need humans to get on. And the opposite is true fully in politics. Humans are not necessarily needed by the political system en masse. It could get by with very few of us participating. But humans living in communities absolutely need systems, fair and democratic ones, that establish political order that allow us to tackle some of those big problems I mentioned off the top, because we haven't figured out any other way to do it. And until we fix that, democracy is going to be unsustainable, because at some point, push will come to shove, and that institution will no longer be relevant to the vast supermajority of people. Just in the same way that an oil company will mine every last bit of bitumen from the ground, so long as it remains profitable to do so, we should fully expect the architects of political campaigns to continue to employ tactics that aren't very good for the long-term health of democracy, as long as that leads to them winning an election. Until we fix that, democracy that we know in Canada and in North America is unsustainable. Second point, our democratic institutions have brought us progress in the past. Public health care, public education, the civil rights that we've been talking about today. But I think future progress, addressing some of the issues I mentioned at the top, requires that we need to build a better democracy. Developing nations, emerging democracies, are learning from the mistakes that we've made. They're developing ways of governing themselves that are better than ours. They're out-innovating us in that way. The next part of my presentation, the last half, I'd like to spend talking about how we can learn from ourselves, how we can act to better our democracy. But it's worth noting that the forces of the status quo, the forces that sustain the system we have, the system that's been around for 100, 200 years, those forces are strong. The problem we're talking about is systemic, and any one of us trying to influence any kind of change in that system is nearly impossible. Our input and efforts to do so are laughably resisted by the established system. I also want to mention this, that the problems we have are no fault of any single individual. That's how systemic problems originate, and that's how they exist so long as we allow them to perpetuate. So we actually need to be intentionally collaborative among the players. The problems we have with our broken democracy are a multi-partisan, multiplayer creation. No single party is responsible for it. No single player in the political system can fix it. We need citizens, we need journalists, we need business people, we need community leaders, we need politicians and party strategists on board with fixing democracy. We need to be intentionally collaborative about how we act together, but before we can do that, we have to figure out how to learn together. Learning, I feel, is about the search for truth, and we can't talk about truth until we get rid of some of the lies that are clouding our vision. I believe that we're propping up our broken democracy with some lies that we've been telling about it. And I think clearing the air on these white lies is actually critical to articulating the difference between the democracy we actually have and the idea of democracy that exists in many of our heads. So lie number one is this: every vote counts. This is one of the first things we learn about in grade school about democracy before we were even allowed to vote. Every vote counts implies that in some way or another, if you vote in an election, your participation has an impact on the outcome of that election. It's not true. In the last provincial election in Nova Scotia, and I'll use Nova Scotia as an example, but many democracies using first past the post as a voting system could do the same thing with their numbers repeatedly, time after time, with their elections. So in the last provincial election in Nova Scotia, 416,000 Nova Scotians got out to vote. But 51% of those Nova Scotians voted for losing candidates. That's a majority. That means that if 210,000 Nova Scotians, the right 210,000 Nova Scotians, stayed home on election night, the exact same people would have won the election. Majority rules. This is another one. And I think it's pretty obvious from the last example that majority does not necessarily rule. Some minorities can rule, but not just any minority. To rule, you need to be good at two things: math and organizing. You need to figure out which combination of electoral math, which ridings you need to win in order to get the right combination of seats won in an election. It doesn't necessarily require earning votes, but it definitely is a game, and people are definitely playing it to win. We get the governments we deserve. This one is a particularly dangerous one, I think, because it implies three things. First, in a democracy, we get the government we deserve implies that, first, there is one single type of democracy, that we have it, and that it's perfect. And I think the previous two white lies we myth-busted here explain that, it's not always the case that we get the government we deserve. The second thing that's troubling about this is that it suggests that if politicians can get away with something, they should get away with something, and then it's our fault for letting them get away with it. Now, these are three of the most troubling white lies I know about. I've got more, but instead of telling you the rest of them, I want to tell you what I think we should do with these white lies. Stephen King said that fiction is a lie, and great fiction reveals the truth behind the lie. And I think that we tell these white lies because we know that they should be true. We know that the majority should rule. We know that every vote should count, and we know that we should get the government we deserve. So, what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time here is tell you a story about the democracy that I think we could have, and I don't think it's that far off. So here goes. In our democracy, every vote counts, and that means that when you vote, it has a direct influence on the legislative law-making power for the people you want in office. It doesn't matter where you're from, what party you vote for, or what candidate you voted for, you have an impact. We did this because we moved away from a first-past-the-post voting system, and we moved towards a system where if the party gets a certain share of votes on election night, that's roughly the same share of seats they have in the legislatures where our laws are made. Majority rules. In our democracy, majority rules because we've built incentives that encourage politicians to negotiate, collaborate, and compromise. We've also made it so that the people who don't do those things are irrelevant in this political system. And we also recognize this, that earning 51% of the vote doesn't really give you much incentive to work with the other 49. So in our democracy, we made it so that there were bonus points, so that 51% as a winning threshold was the minimum requirement, and that if you worked harder to maximize the number of people and politicians and voters that were behind a certain initiative, you got rewards as a politician. And lastly, we get the government we deserve. We get the government we deserve because we fixed the first two things. And in our democracy, now people are getting engaged. People are getting engaged because there's more reasons to do that than there are reasons to stay at home. We don't judge ideas based on where they came from or who came up with them. We judge them based on where they can take us. And we don't just think of democracy as an institution, something we have. We think of democracy as something we do. It's an activity. It's a culture. It's something we're all responsible for promoting, and it's something we all take some responsibility in sustaining. And because of that, because it needs us, because it's sustainable, because we want to be a part of it, it's not something that isn't helping us meet the challenges that right now we don't know how to overcome. So I started by talking about love, and I'm going to end by asking another question about love. How many people here have been in a relationship with someone they deeply love, but at the same time, there are elements of that person's personality that frustrate you in ways that just really get on your nerves? Show of hands. There are, again, several hands up. I feel this way, I felt this way in relationships, and I've also felt that way in the work I do. I love doing it, but it can be very frustrating at times, and it feels like we're pushing up against a brick wall. So I want to leave you with a quote that I find comforting. During times when we must move forward, but it doesn't necessarily seem like there's a way. It comes from the pastor William Sloane Coffin. He said this: there are 3 types of citizens, 2 bad, 1 good. The bad are the uncritical lovers and the loveless critics, and the good are the ones that are willing to carry on a lover's quarrel with their country. It's definitely not easy to be in that 3rd place, but I think it's worth staying there, and I invite you to join me there. Thank you.